This is lecture number 26B on the new class government in Russia. You recall that we had stopped the last lecture at the point at which Putin had won the March 2000 elections and was now president. He had been prime minister for a short period before that. And now I want to go through the period of Russia reconstructs, which is going to last us from 2000 to 2008. And as you can imagine, after all the damage that's been done by these looters and the U.S. and the IMF, that it was going to take another full 8 years to get Russia reconstructed. But when you stop and think about it, that isn't really that long at all, considering the amount of damage that was done. But before we do that, I want to take a quick look at the internal class structure of both the new class and the mafiosos. Now, the new class itself is not monolithic, of course, but its major composition were the educated people of the old Stalin era. You will recall that Stalin had created in the 1930s what he called the classless intelligentsia, which was actually a class. And these people had various kinds of preferences because of the role that they performed in the Soviet economy, and they were highly educated, and they became increasingly so over the years. After Stalin died, they just got bigger and bigger. The basic Soviet economy continued. There was a vested interest of all of the bureaucrats, and by bureaucrats we're counting all the scientists and technicians in every industry and every area of agriculture, and there were millions and millions of them, and they got bigger and bigger as the Khrushchev period evolved. So this is what Putin had to rely upon. To get a good example of what these people are like as real individuals, I suggest you go to the RT, the Russian language or English language Russian broadcast that's on the internet, and in some places they actually do commercial broadcasting. If you go to RT UK, they have commercials on that bunch, and they're on television there. But here in the US, the best way to get it is, and the only way that I know of, is on the internet. But you get 24 hours a day in Spanish, English, and I guess Arabic if you want it. So what you're going to see there is a really interesting group of young women, especially, but also young men, who are the commentators and the investigative reporters. I think probably the most perfect example of a new class person on RT is the woman who has a show called Sophie Cole. Her name is Sophie Shevardnadze. You may remember that name as one of Gorbachev's strongest supporters in Georgia and Russia in his early years. But when you take a look at this woman, who reminds me so much of the kind of young ladies that are educated in U.S. ruling class, finishing schools in the Northeast, you'll be pretty amazed. She not only has a complete command of the politics, but she speaks several different languages perfectly. So there's a good show for you to go take a look at if you want to know what they look like. But there other new class young ladies and men they're investigative reporters, and they're roaming the world. And you could tell by talking to them that these people are extremely well educated, and they're young, and they make excellent television presenters. So this is the best example of the new class that backs Putin today. Now, what about the Mafia? Well, mafiosos don't have this kind of a public persona here or there. Now, they're not all as dumb as Lucky Luciano used to be, but they're certainly not all as smart as Meyer Lansky, or for that matter, Ben Siegel, or Dave, or Mr. Costello, for that matter. But you have a Russian situation. You have the same kind of structure that you have in New York, Los Angeles, and New Jersey. A whole bunch of crews of criminals working on their own projects, and they kick money up to the next boss, exactly as you see portrayed all the time in the Sopranos series. For those of you are familiar with it, and those of you who aren't should get it from the library or whatever and watch it. If you want to take an even closer look at what foreign mafias look like, take a look at the Breaking Bad series, where you get a good view of the kind of mafiosos that are still operating in Mexico, and Bryan Cranston's main opponents in that thing turned out to be Mexican mafiosos. At any rate, what we have in Russia was the same thing, and they started out, of course, in the Soviet Union and brought it to its knees. Now, the one part of the new class there sided with these guys. They used them essentially to perform various functions. And the one I got to know personally were the mafiosos who had extended into Los Angeles. And I got to meet these people when I was a federal prisoner at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Los Angeles around 1990. Now, the feds have been after me for a long time for political reasons. I'm sure that's pretty obvious to you by now. But in this particular case, I had an oil company for several years, and they were using that as an excuse to get at me with the mail fraud and wire fraud laws. So, skipping over my case, which is not of interest to this particular subject, one day I met a Russian who came in there to MDC about a month before I was going on trial. His name was Michael Smushkovich, and he had a partner named Bogi Jovovich. Now, Jovovich's daughter, within a few years, was going to become world famous as an actress, Mila Jovovich, and she eventually got her dad out of jail by hiring a New York law firm with the money she made on that movie Fifth Element with Bruce Willis, and they went out to San Francisco and made a deal with the Ninth Circuit, so he was able to get out of prison with time served, which is neither here nor there, but it gives you an idea of the kind of people that I met. This Smushkovich was a Jewish fellow, so everybody I met through him was part of the Jewish mafia. Now, of course, most of these mafia groups in Russia were not Jewish, but this is the particular one that I got to know. So what happened in his particular case was kind of interesting. I had told him at the time that he came in there and he started asking questions about who he could talk to on our floor at MDC that would know something about the law, and people had referred him to me, and he asked me if I would help him, and I said, "No, Mike, I can't do that. I'm busy defending myself. I don't have time for anybody else." So about a month after that, I was going into trial myself. I believe it was May 13th of 1990, and I was downstairs in the lockup there at the federal courthouse, and I was in my suit because now I'm going to go up in front of the public, and I'm thinking, for a bunch of reasons, it had dawned on me now that I had walked into a trap, and I'd pretty much done it to myself when I had asked the judge to let me defend myself, and he'd said I could. One of my co-defendants was one of my chief salesmen, Ray Martin Hoskins, and in that particular hearing, he had told the judge he wanted to do the same thing. Judge Tashima said, for Dr. Smith to do this is one thing, because he's well educated and he has a legal right to represent himself if he wants to, so I have to let him do that. But he said, Ray, do you realize that if you get convicted, you're going to do 20 years in federal prison? Ray said, I think I want a lawyer after all, so that was the end of that. So I was the only one going to trial on my own. I mean, representing myself. And so the morning that I was supposed to go up there, I had realized over the weekend that for a variety of reasons that this was not going to work, that the public defender they had given me to be my advisor during that period of time wasn't going to be able to help me make the objections that I needed to make, because I really didn't understand how to do it. So I when I got up to the courtroom, I told the judge's clerk, whose name was Shelley, I said, Shelley, would you tell Judge Tashima that I want a lawyer after all? So I knew, because my father's a lawyer and came from a legal family, that judges hate it when they hate to have him defend himself. For one thing, they're going to have to pay attention to every question, every answer, every objection, whereas usually a judge can slip the case if he wants to. And then, as long as both sides are properly represented by counsel, then the next step is to appeal and whatever you have up there. And it wouldn't be a reflection on him, but I knew that his weekend prior to this was probably as bad as mine, because he's thinking, oh my God, this trial's going to go for weeks. I'm going to have to watch every minute of it. And this defendant is kind of a loose cannon on top of all of that, so this is going to be a real challenge for him. So when he came out, and he had a smile on his face, I knew why, of course, and he started up and he told the prosecutors, well, I don't know if you heard what he told my clerk, but the defendant wants to have a lawyer now. Well, his prosecutors, they had a bunch of cops sitting over on the other side of the table. They're saying, oh, we spent $1 million on this. We just brought 40-odd witnesses into Los Angeles. He said he wanted to do it, and the judge says, well, I understand what you're saying, but if he gets convicted and he's asked for an attorney, the Ninth Circuit will automatically order a retrial. So what's the point? So they couldn't answer that. So he said, what I'm going to do is put the defendant on the street. He looked at his book and he said, well, the most he's going to get probably be 18 months. And so he isn't going to run away for that. I'm going to put him on the street on a signature bond. That's where I signed a bond. My wife did, I think I did, saying that, if I skip, I'll pay or something like that. So when I left the courtroom that day, I was feeling pretty good, because federal defendants rarely win anything in the U.S. federal court. It's so well structured by the government that they pick a jury pool of people that are obviously the kind of people that are going to, for the most part, who have bought into the government's bullshit over the years, and they believe anything Washington tells them. So the federal prosecutors very rarely lose anything. Besides, they usually make a deal at some point, and the defendant pleads guilty, and then it's just a matter of sentencing. Well, in this particular case now, I went back to MDC that evening, and the inmates there had all heard about what happened. So they were all standing up and clapping for me when I came in, and they were really excited, because federal inmates never win anything. So this was quite a victory for me, and for temporarily I'd gone from zero to a hero, at least in the minds of these fellows. And Mike Smushkovich comes back to me now, and he says, now I really need your help. And I said, look, the judge had way up, and he said, now, Dr. Smith, now that you're on the street, you're going to have to report to the probation service, and pretrial detention requires you to get a job working for somebody. And so I'd been thinking about that, because I hadn't worked for anybody for a long time. I'd always had my own company, so I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. But Smushkovich comes up at this time, and he says he wants me to, now that I'm going out, to work for him out in the street. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, Mike, I didn't really think this guy was real, but I said, you send $5,000 to, I gave him a bank wiring instructions to this bank account, and $5,000 a week after that, and I will spend a few hours every week on your case. And I thought, well, this will get rid of him. If nothing else, I won't have to be bothered by this anymore. But my wife told me the next day that the money had come into that bank account. I said, well, maybe this guy is for real. And it come from Lithuania. Okay, so all of a sudden I'm beginning to see something. This is a precise in 1990, and we have already talked about that quite a bit, not only in the last lecture, but in the 3 lectures that preceded that. So I got to know Smushkovich pretty well, and I got to know a lot of his friends, because in order to win this case, he had to make he was charged with a medical fraud. Normally in a medical fraud, doctors are billing for something that they did not do, or they're double billing. And this was not the case here. What we had here was a especially Southern California, and he had put in the most modern medical equipment it was possible to buy at that time, and he would run complete tests. So the trick to make this thing work was he had a phone room, and they would call people and they'd say, "You have insurance, and you're sick, you can come down here and we'll give you a $10,000 workup, charge it to your insurance, to the government." Well, to the government in this case, because the government had then its own, and still does, its own insurance company for its own people it cares about. And all of these people on the public tit down in the San Diego region that are resigned from the Navy or the Marines or whatever, they have this kind of U.S. government insurance. So they started presenting these claims for $10,000 apiece to thousands of them started filing these claims. So the government had not wanted to pay those claims, and they had charged Smushkovich with a $1 billion with a B medical fraud. Biggest medical fraud case ever filed, they said. They had sent troops and marshals and helicopters and tanks, machine guns and everything out to the home he lived in Upland, California, which is on the freeway toward Rancho Cucamonga, for those of you who don't know the area. You could look at it. But at any rate, then they brought him in. It would have been a big televised thing, and of course they had their prosecutors up in front of the cameras, like they always do. Usually this is reserved for big Mafia roundups, but this time Smushkovich got it. So I said, "Mike, look, I've studied this thing. What I think is this. Who's to say whether what you did is medically necessary or not?" Well, the postal inspectors have no, as far as I'm concerned, they don't mean shit. I mean, what is a postal inspector? It's just some guy that barely got through high school. So his opinion of a medical fraud is meaningless. What counts here is what does the medical profession think about what you were doing? And the voice of the medical profession are the guys that teach medicine. So what I suggest you do is put together your case, and I'll take it out to the various professors that teach medicine at UCLA. And then eventually we included Drew King, which is the hospital down in the Black Ghetto area of Los Angeles. And I said, then what we have then is 20, we'll shoot for 20. I think in the end we got 25 or 28 medical school professors to sign a book that he dictated to me over the telephone that was called Early Detection. And essentially what it said was that everything that his clinics did was exactly what should be done for somebody that's sick. Now I said, here's what's going to happen. You're going to go into court and they're going to say this doesn't need to be done for this person because he wasn't sick enough. But on the other hand, it won't be hard for us to demonstrate that if you were a member of the board of directors of General Motors, that you would get this kind of treatment every year as a matter of course. So what the government is saying is, for the board of directors at General Motors, it's just fine, but for this common slob that works down here on the assembly line, fuck him. He doesn't need that. So Mike thought this was a good idea, so did Jovovich, and so that's the way we proceeded with that thing. Now, in order to do this, I had to, for a variety of reasons, meet a bunch of people that Smushkovich knew, and these were all these Jewish mafiosos from Lithuania and Moscow and other places that in the Soviet Union. And then, of course, during the period of time, the Soviet Union was finally collapsed, and then we went into the Russian period. But my point is here that it wasn't just I knew one of the women I met, the young women that was helping us, had helped me get that logging sawn for an open hole log out of Russia, but they didn't bring all the stuff with it. I told you that story already. I had sat with her in her house in her living room. She was only about 20 years old, and I listened to her sell a Russian submarine to the Iranian government over the telephone. I mean, this was the kind of looting that was going on over there, and these are the kind of people that were involved in it. There was another guy who had made $200 million simply by not paying the gasoline tax that he had a chain of gas stations that every gasoline distributor, seller is supposed to pay periodically to the federal government on the gasoline taxes. Well, he just kept it. So the thing was, if you steal a couple $100 million from the government that way, or through Alaska land leasing, whatever it may be, then they may force you eventually to give it back. But by that time, if you have any sense at all, you have already used that money to make a lot more money, which of course is what these guys were working on. And what they found is that the U.S. is so poorly policed compared to what they were used to over there in Russia that, boy, they just went gangbusters over here in the States. So take my word for it, I got to meet real gangsters of this Russian Mafia type, at least of the Jewish variety. And of course, some of them spread into others. I mean, we had some from the Ukraine and Armenia that were not Jewish, but at any rate, the point is there was a bunch of them in Los Angeles, and I got to know them all over the next year and a half that I was working for Smushkovich. Smushkovich eventually pled guilty, which was very foolish. I told him about a year and a half later, listen, you plead guilty to this judge. I knew Judge Hatter. I'd been in front of him before. He was the only black judge in the Central District of California. And I said, this guy hates white-collar criminals. You plead guilty to him, that's going to be it. He isn't going to let you withdraw that plea. And, a few days later, which is exactly what happened, Mike tried to withdraw his plea, and in the meantime, he'd convinced Jovovich to do the same thing. He told me to shut up and go away, so as far as I was concerned, I was out of the matter. And, of course, when he went back to ask the judge to that he wanted to withdraw the plea and go to court, the judge said no. So both these guys were stuck with sentences. If it hadn't been for Mila Jovovich becoming an important actress, Bogey wouldn't have gotten out of there either. So they held on to Mike until he agreed to testify against his colleagues, and he went into witness protection. I don't know where the hell he is now. I talked to Bogey from time to time, who's been running a legitimate business out of Las Vegas for many years now, and seems actually a really nice guy. But that is how I got to know these fellas. So what I want to tell you is this: the Russian Mafia was always highly vulnerable to honest men, and but those guys would have to protect themselves. They'd have to stay alive long enough to be able to do something. Well, Putin and Medvedev, as you can see with their Professor Sobchak, who had become mayor of Leningrad and then mayor of St. Petersburg, that was the nucleus that they used to fight their way over that 8-year period from 2000 to 2008 into political power. I won't recap everything that we said yesterday, but let's just start with this point. While Putin's opponents had been preparing for an election in June of 2000, Yeltsin's resignation resulted in presidential elections being held within 3 months, which is what the Constitution required when the president resigned. So on the 26th of March 2000, Putin won his election with a clear plurality of 53%. Now, let's go to the business about what did he do in the next 8 years, because now you have to reconstruct everything. Beginning with energy, the mineral-packed Ural Mountains and the vast oil, gas, coal, and timber reserves of Siberia and the Russian Far East make Russia rich in natural resources, which dominate Russian exports. Oil and gas exports, specifically, continue to be the main source of hard currency. Now, you know that in the last year there have been all kinds of attempts by the U.S. to destabilize Russia and by forcing down the oil prices, along with their allies in the 5 monarchies of the Middle East, which are getting very nervous because those allies of the U.S. in the Middle East realize one thing: they have no popular support at home, and they are highly vulnerable to being overthrown. And if the U.S. may get to the point where they're saying, you know, you guys, we're just going to get rid of you. That way we won't have to pay you anything, and we'll just take everything you got. They're getting real nervous about that. Well, at any rate, the petroleum industry in Russia is one of the largest petroleum industries in the world, and you know, we went through this in previous lectures when we were talking about Russia and Mexico and Venezuela, the major oil-producing countries. And it has been one of the major producers of oil since the late 1800s. Now, of course, it's also a big exporter of natural gas. And now it has a huge new market in China. The Chinese have no use for U.S. imperialism either. They are not fooled by anything that the gringos have done, and they have made a solid economic alliance with Russia. Russia doesn't need anything that the U.S. can offer to it. Doesn't need it at all. And anyway, it doesn't sell much. That doesn't do much business with the U.S. The ones that are really taking it in the ass in this particular case are the Europeans, because the U.S. government forced them into a position where they had to impose sanctions on Russia, which actually just hurt them, didn't hurt Russia a bit. So, Russia also is not only the biggest exporter of oil and natural gas, or one of the biggest in the world, it is the second largest holder of coal reserves, the eighth largest holder of oil reserves, and the largest exporter of oil in the world in absolute numbers. Per capita oil production in Russia is not even all that high, so they're doing all of this with a relatively small human capital investment. As of 2007, Russia was producing 69,600 barrels per day per 1,000 people, much less than Canada or Saudi Arabia, but of course their populations are much larger, or Norway for that matter. But as you can see, that it's more than 2 times that of the USA or the United Kingdom. Now, in terms of mining, Russia is also a leading producer and exporter of minerals and gold. So, Putin not only had to be sure that the oil industry was restructured, that is, you put capital into it to be sure that it's modernized and get it ready to perform the function it can perform, but also he did the same thing with regard to minerals. Now, 90% of Russian exports to the U.S. are minerals or other raw materials. Now, Russia is the largest diamond-producing nation in the world and always has been, estimated to produce over 33 million carats in 2013, or 25% of global output, valued at over $3.4 billion, with the state-owned Alrosa accounting for approximately 95% of all Russian production. Expecting the area to become more accessible as climate change melts Arctic ice, and believing the area contains large reserves of untapped oil and natural gas, that is the Arctic, Russian explorers on the 2nd of August 2007 in submersibles planted the Russian flag on the Arctic seabed, staking a claim to energy resources right up to the North Pole. Reaction to the event was mixed. Vladimir Putin, of course, congratulated the explorers for the outstanding scientific project, while Canadian officials stated the expedition was just a public show, but of course they got real nervous all of a sudden too, because so much of Canadian territory was at least Arctic. Under the federal law on continental shelf development, upon proposal for the federal agency managing the State Fund of Mineral Resources, or its territorial offices, the Russian government approves the list of some sections of the mineral resources that are passed for development without any contests and sanctions. Some sections of federal importance of the Russian continental shelf are important mineral resources, and they're federally owned, and they're situated in Russia, and they stretch out over the continental shelf, so as do the natural gas deposits that are handed over for prospecting and developing mineral resources under a joint license between the government and perhaps some foreign oil company. The Russian government also empowered to decide on the handover of the previously mentioned sections of the mineral resources for development without any contests and sanctions. Now, in fishing and forestry, just a couple comments. The Russian fishing industry is the world's 4th largest, behind Japan, the U.S., and China. Now, in terms of forests, Russia has more than a fifth, more than 20% of all of the world's forests. Now, that makes it the largest forest country in the world. According to a 2012 study by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations and the government of the Russian Federation, the considerable potential of Russian forests is underutilized, and Russia's share of the global trade in foreign products is less than 4%. So in the first 8 years of the Putin administration, not only did they reformulate oil and mining, but they began to put real emphasis on developing both their fishing and their forestry resources. Now, in terms of agriculture, Russia Russia comprises roughly 3/4 of the territory of the former Soviet Union. Now, following the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, and after nearly 10 years of decline, Russian agriculture began to show signs of improvement due to organizational and technical modernization. Northern areas concentrate mainly on livestock, and the southern parts and western Siberia produce grain. The restructuring of the former state farms, however, was an extremely slow process. These collective farmers that had to be forced onto the land as collective farmers to begin with back in 28, 29, 30, cannot be gotten off of their collective farms. They love those state farms. So that change has been very slow, and it has become one of the mainstays of the Communist Party there. The new land code passed by the Duma in 2002 was intended to speed restructuring and attract new domestic investment to Russian agriculture. Private farms and garden plots of individuals now account for over 1/2 of all agricultural production. Well, what's happened is that because of the U.S. aggression against Russia that's characterized the last several years, this whole process of trying to force or trying to restructure these collective farms and cooperatives into some kind of private holdings has come to a screaming halt. Now, private gardens of these individuals still account for over 1/2 of all agricultural production in Russia. But that's something that was well established in the Stalin years and in the early Khrushchev years. Industrial production in Russia decreased 2.10% in February of 2013 over the same month in the previous year. Industrial production in Russia is reported by the Federal State Statistics Service. So, they say that historically 2006 through 2013, Russian industrial production averaged 2.82%, reaching an all-time high of 12.6% in May of 2010 and a record low of 16.9% in January 2009, which of course, as you recall, is right after the collapse of the world capitalist economy at the end of 2008. In Russia, industrial production measures the output of businesses integrated in the industrial sector of the economy, such as manufacturing, mining, and utilities. Russia is one of the most industrialized, of course, of the former Soviet republics, and in the 2000s, Russia's industry, due to increasing demand and improved state financing, emerged from a deep crisis caused by the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the selling off of public property. However, years of low investment continued to leave their mark on the industry's capability, and a lot of its equipment was in need of modernization, and in the first 8 years of the Putin administration, that's exactly what happened. Besides its resource-based industries, Russia has developed large manufacturing capacities, notably in machinery. Now, the defense, that is the war, and the aircraft industries are important employers and are able to internationally offer competitive products for export. And so they have become a major source of income for Russia. Taking the defense industry first, Russia's defense industry employs 2.5 to 3 million people, accounting for 20% of all manufacturing jobs. Russia is the world's second largest conventional arms exporter, after the United States, which is number 1. The most popular types of weaponry bought from Russia are Sukhoi and MiG fighters, air defense systems, helicopters, battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles. The research organization Center for Analysis of Strategies and Technologies ranked the Russian air defense system producer Almaz-Antey as the industry's most successful company in 2007, and it was followed by the aircraft maker Sukhoi. Now, Almaz-Antey's revenue that year, 2007, was $3.122 billion, and it had a workforce of 81,857 people. And if you just saw the May 9th victory parade through Moscow, you will have seen some of the most advanced tanks in the world. Again, now Russia has the best tanks in the world. and it's a long tradition of having the best ones. And of course, they've got the most modern jet fighters, bombers, all kinds of lesser equipment, especially missiles, and they're back in the rearmament has began. By 2008, it was apparent that the United States was going to try and implement the Wolfowitz-Kagan doctrine, which is to block or attack and destroy Iran, Russia, and China. All three of these countries are well aware of that, and so that has forced them to pool their defensive efforts, and now the whole thing is falling against the Americans, who really don't have the ability. They certainly can't beat the Russian army in conventional arms or forces, no matter how they configure them in Western Europe. And to try and have a nuclear attack on Russia might or might not work, but one thing is for sure, it would result in complete destruction of the United States. You might have a few submarines floating around with Americans on it after that. That would be it. It would start to look like what you see in that TV series called Jericho, where different parts of the country go their own way. Those few parts that have survived. Now, at any rate, so now let's take a look at the aerospace industry real quick, because this is an important area, and there have been problems with the Proton rocket in recent years, as you know, and I don't know what exactly the cause of that is. I have a suspicion that the U.S. has figured a way to hack into these systems and have been sabotaging the program, but I haven't heard that come from the Russian government yet, and it probably won't until they figure out exactly how these mistakes and accidents have been happening. But when you set that aside, aircraft manufacturing is the most important industry sector in Russia, employing 355,300 people. The Russian aircraft industry offers a portfolio of international competitive military aircraft, such as the MiG-29 and the Sukhoi 30, while new projects such as the Sukhoi Superjet 100 are hoped to revive the fortunes of the civilian aircraft segment. In 2009, companies belonging to the United Aircraft Corporation delivered 95 new fixed-wing aircraft to its customers, including 15 civilian models. In addition, the industry produced over 141 helicopters. It is one of the most science-intensive, high-tech sectors and employs the largest number of skilled personnel. The production and value of the military aircraft branch far outstrips other war industry sectors, and aircraft products made up more than half of the country's arms exports. The space industry of Russia consists of over 100 companies and employs 250,000 people. The largest company of the industry is RKK Energia, the main manned space flight contractor. Leading launch vehicle producers are Khrushchev and TS-SKB Progress. The largest satellite developer is Reshetnev Information Satellite Systems, while NPO Lavichin is the main developer of interplanetary probes. Now, going back to the automotive industry. Automotive production is a significant industry in Russia, and it has been since the 1930s, directly employing around 600,000 people, or 0.7% of the country's total workforce. In addition, the industry supports around 2 to 3 million people in related industries. So, Russia was the world's 15th largest car producer in 2010 and accounts for about 7% of the worldwide production. In 2009, the industry produced almost 600,000 light vehicles, down from 1.5 million in 2008 due to the global financial crisis. The largest companies are light vehicle producers, AvtoVAZ and Gaz, while Chems, a leading heavy vehicle producer. 11 foreign car makers have production operations or are construction plants in Russia. That may now change because of the decision of the Putin government has been to get back to the Stalin years where completely self-sufficient and substitute all imports, in which case these companies that come from Western Europe and the U.S. will simply be out of luck. Russia is experiencing a regrowth of microelectronics with the revival of Jace Micron An example of a successful Russian consumer electronics company is Telesystems, whose products are sold in over 20 countries. Now, in addition to all of this, we have the Chinese market, which is expanding monthly at a tremendous percentage. And I don't have the newest figures in any of these areas for these monthly figures, but you'll see coming out on CCTV, that is China Central Television, which you can get 24 hours a day in English, which is now just about as good as RT on the internet. You will see these contracts are coming on a monthly basis, and you'll see how the production ratios are increasing, how the Russians and Chinese have a symbiotic relationship here. One is a market, the other is a provider. It moves back and forth according to what the subject is, but the Chinese jets, the military operations, are as advanced as you can imagine. They can certainly handle any U.S. fighters, especially these that don't work. Like this big boondoggle they've got, the Pentagon is pushing right now. But at any rate, these the point here is that in the reconstruction of this the Russian economy, the Putin government has been extremely successful. People have gone back to work. There's a new social safety net in place, and as far as I can tell, the Russian population is about as happy as they could be in most cases. So this accounts for the fact that why Putin's popularity is up over 80%. Is there any other country in the world where a president has an over 80% approval rating? Maybe in Zimbabwe. I don't know. I think I saw the last election he got 99% or something like that. But at any rate, generally speaking, Russia has reconstructed. Now, just as a few comments on what's going to come next, I want to get to the question of dialectical materialism, because virtually everything we've talked about so far in this lecture series is historical materialism. So for those of you who are interested in dialectical materialism, let me say that the most important book of the 20th century in philosophy is, in my opinion, is Lenin's book, Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, which you can get in virtually any library. Now, it may not be easy to follow, but it's the subject matter is Ernst Mach's thesis with regard to the Heisenberg principle, and I wrote a rebuttal to all of this in a book called New Perspectives in Physics, following up on what Lenin had done in his book, and we're going to take that as the textbook for these next few lectures in dialectical materialism. So for those of you who are interested in this subject, let me suggest that you take the time in the next week or two to read that book of Lenin's, and then we will go into my modernization of that entire debate, because of course the subatomic physics has evolved a long way since the time of Ernst Mach and V.I. Lenin, and so we have all kinds of new evidence we can use to prove the same points that Lenin was trying to make at the time. So with that, I'm going to conclude this particular lecture.